Hi, I hope you all can sort of see me now. I just wanted to say hi and introduce myself. I'm Samantha Beaver. I'm really excited to be here, and I'm excited to sort of interface with you in this virtual environment. So please shoot any questions you have during the presentation into the chat, and I'll do my best to answer them. I want this to be as interactive for you as possible. And so without further ado, I'll get right down to it. Okay. So today, as you know, we'll be talking about the gendered language of leadership. And before we get into the meat of the presentation, I'd actually like to start with an opening activity. And so in the chat section, please tell me what your biggest language pet peeve is. So I have here that you should type 3 of your top 3 language pet peeves. Not everyone has that many, so if you only have one, that's fine. But I have some examples here. So when people write affect for affect, or when someone says literally, but they actually mean figuratively. And be prepared to be called on, of course, to explain a little bit about what about your pet peeve annoys you. One of my pet peeves is when people don't use the past participle when they're supposed to, and they use just the regular past tense. So yeah, I'll give it like, I don't know, 30 more seconds. Oh, these are all really great. I love it when people share their language pet peeves. Yes, I see a lot of past participle ones. I'm totally with you on that. Very annoying. Okay, so I think that's probably a good enough list. Feel free to peruse this on your own time too, because this is a really hilarious list of language pet peeves. One that sort of stuck out to me was Susan sharing using beg the question to mean raise the question. That's sort of interesting. I've never heard that one before, but that is a good pet peeve. Another one that is nice is the difference among being more than 2 versus difference between being just for 2, from Cheryl Henderson. That is a very specific language pet peeve. I like it. Yeah, so these are all so great. Okay, well, thank you all for participating in this activity. I really like to start with this because I think it gets everyone thinking about language in a general sense, and it also sort of illustrates, to yourself that even when, if you don't typically think of yourself as maybe being a language person, that all humans care a lot about language, and we have really strong opinions about what's right and what's wrong, and how language is best used. So my name is Samantha Beaver. I'm an academically trained linguist, and I just want to share a little bit about myself before we get into the meat of our presentation. So I completed my graduate work at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and I guess I should share a little bit about what linguistics is for those of you who don't know. Linguistics is the scientific study of language, and so linguists who study linguistics, they study how language works as a system in the brain, so cognitively, but also out in the world in context. An example of a context would be like a workplace context, which is what I have some expertise in. And linguistics as a field is actually the best way to understand people in some ways, because everybody talks, and we reveal who we are through the words that we use. But not a lot of people in the workplace is thinking about people analytics in terms of language. And that's actually why I started my company, Memra Language Services. So Memra is an ancient Hebrew word that means language itself can do things in the world separate from a speaker. And as a linguist, I completely believe the sentiment to be true. And so Memra really does 2 things functionally. The first thing is that we analyze ambient workplace communications. So you can think of Slack feeds or free response sections on surveys or internal meeting recordings. And then we also design and execute language-based training, similar to what you're experiencing today. In this specific training, I am going to walk you through 3 I'm calling them here takeaways. And actually, there should be a downloadable PDF that has a summary of each takeaway for you to take with you after the session is over. So don't feel too much pressure about taking intense notes. I have some of those already written down for you. But really, the function of each of these takeaways is actually somewhat of a reframing exercise. In the first one, we're going to reframe the way we think about language to be more technological in nature. In the second one, we're going to reframe how we think about language as a signaling tool for identity. And then the last one, finally, language, reframing it to be, the actual action of leadership. And of course, all of these takeaways will fit together so that by the end, we'll be ready to talk about examples of impact and options to be strategic with the information you've learned. And then another thing to note, just by way of a roadmap, is that once we move through each of these takeaways, we're going to take a 1-minute break. So I will turn off my microphone, and we can all, get up, go to the bathroom, get water, and if you don't want to do those things or take a break, there will be questions in the chat section for you to answer and engage with some of your fellow attendees. And then if we have time, I'll go through and answer some of those questions as well. But yes, please, if you do have questions that come up while you're listening, go ahead and put them in the chat. I can't promise I'll get to them right away, but I know how that is when sometimes you have a question, but then it sort of escapes you by the end of the presentation. So feel free to use that function freely. Okay, so let's get into it. The first takeaway here is that language is the best technology humans have ever invented. And this is sort of a radical idea, so I'm sort of taking the burden on myself to convince you that this is true by the end of this takeaway section. And I think the best place to start, of course, is with a definition, right? What is language and what is technology? So language is a systematic means of communicating ideas or feelings by using by the use of conventionalized signs, sounds, gestures, or marks having understood meanings. And technology is a manner of accomplishing a task, especially using technical processes, methods, or knowledge. And I've sort of highlighted and underlined here the parts of the definition that are similar, right? So while language is a means of communicating, technology is a manner of accomplishing a task, right? And if we think of communication as our task that we're trying to accomplish, and then language as the manner by which we're accomplishing that task, it's really clear it becomes very clear how language can be understood as a technology. I think one of the reasons why we don't usually talk about language in this way is because we conflate language and communication, especially in workplace contexts. The phrase workplace communication is something that's tossed around a lot, but what that does is it sort of says that language and communication are the same. But when we pick apart these definitions, we can really see that language is actually the system that we're using to accomplish the task of communication. And it's in that way that we can better understand how language functions within our task of communicating. And so, why is workplace communication sort of a problem? These two statistics are from Gallup polls, and they really highlight the need to reframe language as a technology for ourselves and in the workplace. The first one reads that 96% of executives cite ineffective communication as being the reason for workplace failures, and 33% of employees say that lack of open communication has the most negative impact on morale. The amazing things about these statistics is that those percentages are really high. So those of you who are academics in the group will be like, wow, 96%, that's crazy. And in some ways, it makes sense to have a high percentage here because you have to communicate well to do every single part of every single job in every single business. But then there's a really terrible thing about these statistics too, and that's that nobody really knows what ineffective communication or lack of open communication really means. And while we may be able to think of specific examples, there's not sort of this objective underlying understanding of a system that's broken. And because of that, workplaces have a really hard time solving for something as nebulous as bad communication. But when we apply a technological lens to this issue, right, we can actually translate those nebulous phrases. Ineffective communication can become technological failure. And lack of open communication can become refusing to use company technology or the company's technological processes. And if we rewrite the statistic altogether, it reads 96% of executives cite technological failures as being the reason for workplace failures. And of course, that is sort of embarrassing because what that brings to mind is something like the printer being broken or even a server being down. And those types of technologies, it would never be allowed for them to actually impact workplace outcomes, right? Because they would be fixed right away. And I think the reason for this is that, when we think of technology, we think of it as something that we can control and something we can optimize. And so when we stay in communication land, it feels like there's no way we can optimize it. But when we take a step out of communication land and actually think about language as a system that we're using to communicate, we realize optimization is possible. And so all that to say, right, when we reframe language as a technology, all of a sudden we become more motivated to make sure that it's running smoothly for us, just like we care that the printer is running well, because we don't want it to get in our way of achieving the outcomes that we're looking to achieve. Okay, so everybody, this is the takeaway slide for takeaway number 1. If you download the PDF that's attached to this presentation, you will get this slide and a slide like this for the takeaways. So right now, we're going to take a 1-minute break. I'm going to read whatever has been posted in the chat, and you can look at the questions in the chat, and feel free to answer them or get a drink or whatever, and we'll be back here in 60 seconds. As you slowly come back to the presentation, just to sort of recenter on what we just covered in our first takeaway, the idea that language is the best technology humans have ever invented. And yes, okay, so maybe the best was an exaggeration, but just the idea that we're reframing language to think of it as a technology that we can leverage in the workplace. And what this reframing does is it helps us change our understanding of better workplace communication as the goal, and language as the tech system that we're using to achieve that goal. And this will help us make concrete improvements in workplace communication. And when I say concrete, I mean measurable improvements, because language is hearable, seeable, countable, practicable, learnable, and optimizable, unlike something that is hard to measure, like communication in a general sense. Now, hopefully, I've sort of brought you along and you've bought into that argument. Okay, language is a technology, we get it. But we all know intuitively that fixing language problems is not as simple as fixing something like a printer, right? So even if we buy into the idea that language can be understood as a tech, it's a complicated tech. And why is that? What makes language so complicated? And this leads us right into our second takeaway, which is that language signals who we are. And this is really what makes language a complicated living technology. Let's see here. I'll start again with a definition, just like in the first section. So our language technology is something used to consciously communicate ideas, right? That's its conscious function. But it also has some unconscious functions. And in this case, that function is to express internal culture, identity, thoughts, and feelings. A good example of this is if I say to Sarah, Sarah, the sky is blue. My conscious objective for saying that sentence is to tell her that the sky is blue. It's to communicate that information, right? Information transfer. But the second I open my mouth, Sarah knows a lot more things than just the sky is blue. When she hears me talk, she can tell I'm a woman. She can probably guess my age pretty well, or at least for sure she can put me in the category of young. She probably knows where I'm from, roughly, right? I'm from the Midwest. She probably can hear that. She might even be able to make some really accurate guesses about the type of family I grew up in, what education level I have. and so on and so forth, right? And so this makes our language tech really complicated. We have these barnacles of identity information attaching themselves to every sentence we say. And sometimes those barnacles can get in the way of good communication, especially when you have two people communicating together that are very different, right? And so we're going to test this idea now of language as a technology that signals who we are, our identity, okay? And so what we're going to do is we're going to join a live poll. The only thing you need to participate in this poll is your cell phone. And so what you need to do is go into your text function, and the number you're texting to is 22333, and then in the text section, type Samantha Beeve 968, and you'll join the poll. So I'm going to give everyone a few minutes to join the poll here. All right, I'll just give everyone a couple of seconds still. Okay. Oh, good. All right. So, of course, you know, in this environment, you're not actually sitting next to somebody. You can just imagine in a post-COVID world where you're allowed to sit next to someone at a conference presentation, how they might say it. Hey, yes, okay, excellent. All right, we have a lot of responses. This is great. Okay, so what is the purpose of asking this question, right? The first thing to notice is that all of these responses are different. Okay, so we all shared the same communicative task, and it's a simple one. It is asking or you know, imagining how somebody that's next to you would ask, you know, you to close your window if they were in your house, for example, and they were cold. Almost every single person came up with a different response, which illustrates how even though we might share the same communicative task, the way that we employ our language technologies to achieve that task comes out really differently, in part because of those identity barnacles, as I'm going to call them, right? Everyone is picking a different syntactic form with different like semantic word choices, right, to you know, achieve this task. And those decisions are being made unconsciously, and they're informing what actually, you know, comes out of our mouths. And that's not even taking into account other information, linguistic information like intonation and something like that, right? This is just the written form, and they're all so different. And we can call out, you know, a couple of examples here. So I like the example, would you mind if we close the window? I'm a little cold. So that's an example of a more indirect response. So would you mind? And if we close the window, and then, you know, I'm a little cold, adding that little in there, sort of like a hedging particle. We'll see an example of that next. And I noticed, though, that all of these responses are actually pretty polite. So sometimes when I do this activity, there's always that one person that puts in, shut the window. So everyone in this group is very, you know, polite, which is good. All right, so for the next activity here, the next poll question. Oh, yeah, here we are. Okay, so in the same poll function, texting a response. I'll read it out loud. If you overheard Taylor say, "I'm sort of cold in here," to Riley, what assumption would you make about Taylor's identity? So you all can go ahead and do that. Okay, it looks like responses have slowed down. Yes, okay, so B is our winner. That is a typical response. So if you were to poll people, this is generally what they select. And usually, you know, no offense, everyone who has selected number or letter B, but usually what they're thinking is that Taylor is definitely a female, but they just want to leave that little space of doubt in there, so they choose B because they can't be 100% sure. And the reason is that you're like, well, yeah, I'm sort of cold in here. A female would say that, is more likely to say that than a man. And none of you, well, actually, I shouldn't say that. Some of you might be linguists, but even if you're not a linguist, you didn't have to be a linguist to guess that and probably be correct. And I know, as a linguist, right, that the thing that you're picking up on is actually a sort of particle. So a sort of is a hedging particle, and those occur with a much higher frequency in female speech than they do in male speech. And so with a lifetime of feedback of talking to men and women, you all, were able to sort of come to the same conclusion that Taylor is probably a woman. All right, so that's another example of that identity information, sort of putting barnacles onto the thing that, or the information that we're trying to communicate, right? Okay, so the next poll, I think my screen is going to shift here in a second. It's a little on the slower side. Okay, I can now see my shifted screen, so I hope you can too. Okay, we're going to do 2 more questions in this poll. And the next 2 questions are going to be about this dialogue. Okay, so I'm going to read it out loud. Feel free to sort of read it along with me here. Amy and Kevin are coworkers, and they're having a conversation about a broken printer. Amy walks up to Kevin's cube and says, "The printer is still broken?" And Kevin looks up from his work and says, "I don't know, is it?" And Amy says, "Yeah, I just tried to make 20 copies, and it's not doing anything." Kevin said, "You should try emailing technology services." And Amy, who is now annoyed at Kevin, says, "Well, if it isn't fixed by Thursday, there's no way we're going to be able to meet this deadline." And then she walks away. Okay? So the next 2 questions are about this conversation. And in the chat function, you should be able to see this dialogue shared there. Okay, so on the next slide is the first question. And it says, during this conversation, Amy becomes annoyed at Kevin. Select the line in the dialogue where miscommunication happens. So if you're able to see the dialogue in the chat function, you can go ahead and select which line, like where the miscommunication happened. Okay, it seems like answers have slowed down. I love that line B, or line number 2 won for this one, because normally it doesn't, but that means that we probably have a lot of women in this group. A lot of times line A will win. And the reasoning that most people give when asked is that Amy should have never walked up to Kevin in the first place. She approached the situation all wrong. But line B says that, oh, maybe the miscommunication happened with Kevin, which I appreciate because I don't get that response a lot. Okay, so let's move on to the next one, because the next question, then we'll talk a little bit about Amy and Kevin and what happened in this conversation. Okay, so for this next one, it's just asking you to decide who is at fault for the miscommunication on the whole. Is it Amy's fault or Kevin's fault? This is an oversimplification, so try to just put your, minds that like to think in gray spaces away, and try to just pick, if you had to, choose one of them. Okay, so it looks like in general we think that it was Amy's fault. This is common. This is what I get a lot when I do this activity. And typically what we say, or what I hear, when we have discussions about this dialogue, is that Amy is being unprofessional here because she's being passive aggressive. And then, okay, so how is Amy being passive aggressive? Well, they say, Amy clearly wants Kevin to help her fix the printer, but she doesn't ask for his help. And so she's being too indirect, and so that is seen as it's unprofessional in the workplace. And how is Kevin supposed to know what she really needs, right? And I'm sorry, all of you that selected Amy, I'm sort of putting these words in your mouth because we don't have the benefit of being able to have an open discussion about this right now. But a lot of times, that's sort of the common sentiment, or at least a sort of a high-level summary of what people are feeling about Amy and why it might be her fault. The interesting thing about that is that somehow almost every single person is able to understand what Amy is what her true intentions are in this dialogue. It's only 5 lines long, and a lot of times both women and men understand right away that Amy is trying to ask Kevin for help. And so the issue is actually not in understanding, right? So we like to say, like, well, how was Kevin supposed to know she was asking for help? And yet all of us knew she was actually wanting his help, right? And so we like to say that the issue is understanding. If you're being indirect, you're being unclear. But actually, what we see when we dive into this and see what linguistic research has to say about indirectness is actually has very little to do with clarity. Because Amy's purpose here is clear. What it has to do with is a more nuanced problem of indirectness being sort of deemed unprofessional in workplace environments. And we're going to find out why. Okay, so now that we've sort of gone through that Amy and Kevin activity, and I know that that's sort of, it's a fun poll to be a part of, and I wish that we, were able to discuss this more sort of in real time, because people generally really, like to talk about the results of that poll. But just because virtual platform, we're going to move on. So we want to apply this idea now of language as a technology and then language as a signaler, like an identity signal, to male and female identities in the workplace. And the reason why we're applying them to male and female identities in this binary sense is because of what we know and what has been borne out in research, that female identities have a lot of barriers to leadership in the workplace. And so we're going to focus on that group, even though, in today's world, we know that the only 2 identities. But we are focusing on that group because we want to address the problem, which is that, women sometimes struggle to achieve the same kind of leadership recognition that men do, or leadership positions in the workplace. So to unpack, though, male and female speech in the workplace, we have to start at the very beginning, about how boys and girls are socialized to use as children. And so I'm going to play this clip for you, even though it is fairly long. But I think you're really going to love it, and it'll also give you a break from listening to me chatter on. And so hopefully it'll work, and if not, I can do a quick summary. So one of the things that Deborah Tannen talks about is the difference between rapport talk and report talk. These 2 things describe how boys and girls are socialized to use language. So another way to think about this is a lot of times we think about socializing girls into a feminine identity through things like, gifting them Barbies at their birthday, or buying pink clothes for them. And those are all true forms of socialization to certain degrees. But the more subtle way that we socialize boys and girls into their gender types is through language use, actually. And unfortunately, this is completely unconscious on the part of the parent or, the society that the child is growing up in. So it's really hard to control this piece. And so report talk and report talk are just some features of that type of language socialization. So both of these types of speech have to do with relationship building. Rapport talk is relationship building through sameness. So this sort of establishes a flat relationship as opposed to a hierarchical relationship. And report talk is, the opposite, right? Relationship building through difference. So on the video that hopefully you'll have time to watch on your own, Deborah Tannen gives these examples of 2 little girls who are sitting next to each other, and they're sitting facing one another, and they say, my babysitter has braces, and the other girl says, my babysitter has braces too. Another girl says, wow, the same, right? So they're sharing these things about their life that establish them as, matching. Like, we're the same, and I'll share a trouble, now you share a trouble, and I'll share a celebration, now you share a celebration, right? And that's how they're building their friendship. In report talk, she gives the example of there's a group of boys, and they're playing on the playground, and one boy says, I can throw the ball up to the top of the slide, and the next boy says, I can throw the ball to the top of the building, and then the last little boy says, I can throw the ball to the moon, and then they all laugh, and they're having fun, right? So they're building their friendship through establishing difference and placing themselves in the hierarchy. And I just want to say that sometimes that idea of hierarchy, has a negative connotation, especially when we think about organizational structures. It's sort of like not in vogue right now to be super hierarchical. However, I just want to encourage you to not attach a negative connotation to hierarchy in this situation, because it's just another strategy for relationship building. In some ways, you can understand it as actually everything is more clear if I understand where I am in relation to you, right? So it's really about that. And you can maybe even think of a relationship instead of a friend relationship, one of like a father and a son, right? So that's still it can be a loving relationship. It's still hierarchical, but that hierarchy is important for the relationship to feel secure. So anyways, so that's just one example of a conversational ritual that we learn as children. And then over time, as we become adults, these conversational rituals sort of turn into what sociolinguists call conversational style. And so that style can be normatively masculine or normatively feminine. And of course, for your benefit, I've put these in clouds because we know that these aren't fixed categories, right? Not every person, is always normatively feminine in their speech all the time. But it's important to sort of call them out as categories because in research, we know that these traits of these categories bear out across genders, right? So normatively feminine and normatively masculine styles have traits sort of that define them, right? I have a question posted up here. Can you guess which conversational style is normatively masculine and which is normatively feminine? This is sort of a trick question because it should be fairly obvious. So on the left side, you see request feedback, indirect, conciliatory, collaborative, person and process oriented, effectively oriented. Versus interrupting, direct, confrontational, autonomous, task outcome oriented, referentially oriented. So as you can see on the left, we have normatively feminine conversational style and a normatively masculine conversational style. This is going to be important though later, these descriptive words, when we talk about leadership. And you'll see why. But just sort of keep them, in your back pocket. But we're really here to focus on normatively feminine conversational style because we're talking about women in leadership, right, and how leadership language is gendered. And so I want to give you two linguistic examples. So we've been talking at a pretty high level, and I just want to give you a taste at what a linguist might do if they were analyzing a sentence for these indicators. So here's an example sentence. It reads, just why would you know how to facilitate a team icebreaker? The implication is that, of course, that person wouldn't know how to facilitate a team icebreaker. And so if a linguist looks at this sentence and is looking for indicators of a normatively feminine conversational style, the first thing that they would notice is the use of irony and the use of rhetorical questions. And the linguistic function of these two features is to de-emphasize the negative message of the sentence, right? They could have just said, you don't know how to facilitate a team icebreaker, but of course, that would have been too direct. So to sort of mitigate that negative message, the speaker has used a rhetorical question. And then also to emphasize in-group solidarity. So the speaker is trying to be person-oriented and effectively oriented by indicating like, hey, we're a group of people that do know how to facilitate a team icebreaker, and I'm sort of making an ironic joke to tell you, like, you're really in that group, right? So that's sort of, an example of maybe a linguistic analysis or a linguistic approach to understanding normatively feminine conversational style. The second example, the sentence reads, I just really am sad because of it, I guess. And so this example is indirect, conciliatory, and effectively oriented. And the main linguistic feature that stands out in this sentence is hedging particles. There are actually a lot of them in this short sentence. Just, really, that, and I guess are all hedging particles. And what it does is it makes the overall sentence more indirect, but especially the I guess at the end makes the overall sentence conciliatory, where the speaker is essentially saying, I'm sad, but by adding I guess at the end, I'm going to allow you, the other speaker, to give me a good reason why I actually might not be sad, right? It sort of gives the other speaker room to contradict, the point that's trying to be made. So where the speaker could have said something like, "This is making me sad," instead she's chosen to say, "I just really am sad then because of it, I guess." And, after looking at those specific weedy examples, that just gives you a little taste of sociolinguistics, right? It's important to remember that 0% of adults use the same conversational style all the time. We know this, and what else do instead of using the same style all the time is that they subconsciously shift their conversational style depending on the context of the linguistic interaction. And this is called discursively constructing your identity. And this is really important when we talk about becoming leaders, and specifically women becoming leaders. One really salient example of this is you can imagine a 15-year-old teenage boy who, talks one way with his friends and then talks another way with his grandma. And the first thing that maybe comes to your mind is swearing. Like, yeah, he swears a lot with his friends, but he would never swear with his grandma. That is sort of a surface level example of what is going on with discursively constructing your identity. But I want to encourage you to think of it more deeply than just word choice. Because actually what that teenage boy is doing is that when he meets with his friends, he's using language to make himself into the person that he wants to be with his friends. And similarly, when he's with his grandma, he's using language to make himself into the grandson he wants to be with, right? So it's not just word choice, and it's not just saying, like, I can say this word here, but I can't say this word here. That's much too simple. It goes much deeper than that to being the type of person you want to be through language. And that's why this is a really important concept for leadership. I have one more example of discursively constructing your identity that is non-workplace oriented, and that is primary caregiver discourse. So those of you who are mothers in the group might be able to relate to this. So a linguist studied just the concept of discursively constructing your identity by interviewing two couples and then following them around and recording what their speech. And so both of the couples, were committed or had verbally said that they were committed to sharing child rearing and work responsibilities equally. And one couple even ensured this by arranging their work schedules so that each one, like both the mother and the father, enjoyed one full day every week as the primary caregiver. So that's quite progressive and also quite challenging to do. Work schedules in general. So these couples were committed. They were like, there is no primary caregiver. We are sharing this equally. However, after studying their language patterns, what Kendall found was that the mothers, discursively constructed their own identity as being the primary caregiver. And so I have an example, a dialogue for Mom 2, and then for Mom 1, I just have a little blurb because the dialogue was too long. But essentially, when Mom number 1 was talking with a friend, she refers repeatedly to her employment as being optional or contingent on the cost of daycare, therefore situating herself as the primary caregiver. And then with Mom number 2, there's this dialogue here where they're talking about a cough drop, and the dad gives the cough drop. The mom's like, "Why did you give that kid a cough drop? It's yucky." And the father defends his actions or whatever. But by having the final word here, the mom is sort of using language to unconsciously, maybe, it's not her intention. She's stated that it's not her intention to be the primary caregiver, but by overriding the decision of the other caregiver, it puts her word as final, therefore situating her her identity as being the primary caregiver. So these are just two examples outside of a workplace context, but you can imagine how complicated it is with other identities that we have as well, right? Because a parent identity is just one of the many that we navigate in our life, right? And so what's the takeaway from this, right? Language signals who we are authentically, right? But not always the person we want to be. So we can try to discursively construct our identities with the tools we have in our linguistic awareness portal. So for that 15-year-old boy, because swearing is super salient and it's like at the forefront of his mind, he's able to control that from situation to situation. But there are other more subtle types of linguistic features that are harder for us to control unless we, become grow our awareness in our linguistic system, our language technology, essentially, to make sure that we can sort of leverage language to become the person we want to be. Okay, so that was a long section, but we're almost there to sort of the final bang. This section was language signals who we are. This is our takeaway slide. So I'm to give everyone 60 seconds to take a break and digest what you just heard. I will answer questions in the chat, and then we'll be back here in just a minute. Oh, everybody. That was about a minute. So we're going to move on to our next takeaway. Remember, these sort of summary slides are going to be available to you through a PDF download, so they can sort of function as your notes. All right. So we're ready to move finally into, applying this idea that language is a technology, and then applying the idea that language signals who we are to the question of leadership. And so our third and final takeaway here is that language is what we use to do leadership. And just like with the other sections, I'm going to start off with a definition. So this is the sociolinguistic definition of leadership. Leadership is the linguistic choices that leaders make as they go about their daily business of 1, maintaining good working relationships in order to 2, make effective decisions, and 3, get essential work done. So to better understand this, and to highlight the idea that leadership is the linguistic choices that leaders are making, we're going to break that definition down as per 1, 2, and 3. So this next slide, you should be able to see the functions of leadership language, and so how we actually do leadership with language. The first one is that number 1, cultivate relationship function. This refers to interpersonal communication. Then the second one is the number 2, make decisions. This refers to the authoritative communication. And the final one, number 3, achieving outcomes, refers to the interaction between interpersonal and authoritative communication. So that third function of leadership language is really about integrating interpersonal and authoritative communication. And we're going to see now how women specifically, because of the way they've been socialized, and then also because of sexist tendencies in the workplace, face very real linguistic barriers to becoming successful leaders. And I'll give you a hint here. That number 1, cultivate relationships, interpersonal communication, that's usually not the issue. And in fact, the 2 examples that we are going to look at are with number 2, the authoritative communication piece, and then number 3, integrating interpersonal and authoritative communication. So the first example we're going to look at is a phenomenon called double voicing, which is a subset of a larger phenomenon called silencing. And then the second example is called a double bind. All right, so to start with double voicing, Judith Baxter, 2010, is sort of the authority on this, although many linguists have published research on this concept. And to sort of understand it, we have to start at the beginning. So double voicing really starts with the idea of having a voice, and this concept of having a voice has been very important in linguistic research on female leadership in the past. And so really what goes, the issue with having a voice is that even if a woman does gain a leadership position, her voice may not count in decision-making forums. And so in things like management meetings, right, women are often silenced by being ignored, interrupted, mocked, or criticized. And I just want to call out here that those words, ignored, interrupted, mocked, and criticized, those sound very strong. But in the context of a management meeting, being ignored doesn't always look bad. and being interrupted isn't always like extremely rude, right? These things can happen in very subtle ways, and in fact, they can happen under guise of professionalism. So I just want to call that out, that it's not always overt. In fact, it's usually covert. And so what has happened over time is that as a defense mechanism against outright silencing, women learn, and actually learn is maybe the wrong word. They, sort of unconsciously, right, develop this technique called double voicing, which means preempting a possible criticism from others by stating that criticism themselves first. So I have some examples up here, but I'm sure like you can think of countless others where you're like, oh my gosh, I just did that this morning. So an example, I realize I'm no expert in marketing, but ... I'm not sure if this is the direction you want to take, but we could. Or go ahead and interject if I'm wrong on this, right? So, just to summarize, double voicing is really, anticipating silencing that's going to happen, like, unconsciously, right? So-and-so leader is going to say this if I say this, so I'm just going to say it first. And of course, what it does is it really undermines your own authority, to sort of take away your authority first and then make your suggestion, right? So this is called double voicing. The second example, and again, these are just two examples, right, of linguistic barriers to leadership. I don't want to, sort of overwhelm with the whole gamut, but I think these are really good examples because they're sort of clear and they have high frequency. So this one is called the double bind. And in order to understand the double bind well, we have to start at the top with the male as normal stereotype in leadership. So what that means is that when we think of effective leadership, we use words such as authoritative, assertive, adversarial, competitive, task-oriented, goal-oriented, or single-minded. And this goes back to, if you look at this list and then you sort of go back in your mind to that list of normatively masculine conversational styles, this list really matches that list well, right? So it's the idea that being a good leader, or being a leader at all, not even a good leader, is synonymous with masculine conversational style that makes it hard for women to fit into that group of leader, right? Their language use. So women then, of course, have to work harder than men to gain the same respect as leaders, and then often in an attempt to do so, have to adopt a masculine style of conversation, or linguistic style. And so this traps them often in something called the double bind, by which they appear too masculine to the people that they're trying to lead, or they're characterized, and then they're characterized as aggressive, or they appear overly feminine to their fellow leaders. They're characterized as tentative or weak. So they're trying to fit into this group that is like male by nature, and so they're trying to approximate a masculine conversational style, and it sort of fails on all sides in some ways, right? And so the examples I have here are actually not of what that leader would say, but of what the people they're trying to lead might say about them. So, something like, she's so high-strung, I could never live my life like that. I don't feel like she's open to anyone's feedback. She's a little intense, so take what she says with a grain of salt. That one is a direct quote from my own personal experience. Something must be going on with her outside of work, right? These types of things. Because what happens if you're a woman and you sort of say, like you reject a feminine communication style in favor of a masculine communication style, it harms your ability to lead other women well, because it's confusing and also not honoring, right? But then at the same time, if you're trying to be something that's like a stretch out of your natural conversational style, you might be. It's also confusing to the group that you're trying to stretch into, because you might not be fitting in as well as you think you are. And so then, really, what we see both with double voicing, the first example, is that it undermines a woman's communicative authority, and then the double bind really undermines female leaders' ability to achieve outcomes, while also enabling the idea that good leader is synonymous with masculine communication style. And we don't want that, right? What we want is we want women to be able to fit into that category of leaders while also still using a feminine communication style if they want to, right? And And one thing before I move on that's really important to point out about both of these linguistic barriers is that even though both the double bind and double voicing are things that women do to themselves as linguistic strategies, the reason for these linguistic strategies is a sexist environment that they're forced to navigate. So I like to focus on these because these are actionable, and if you're a woman in the audience, you can identify these, in yourself. But know that, identifying these and trying to work on not doing some of these things doesn't get rid of the environment that caused them to begin with, right? So we sort of have extra work to do. But let's move on here and apply these concepts to real life examples of female leaders. So I have here something called Sinclair's quadrant, and it is an axis, and on the x-axis we have the communication style. So on the one side we have the denial of feminine communication style versus the acceptance of feminine communication style, and then on the y-axis we have on the top the position of high power and versus the position of low power. The only important thing to notice here is that the position of high power and low power does refer to the organizational title of the female leader. It just refers to how much power they're able to execute within their role. And so I'm going to explain here examples of each of the 4 leader types. And as I'm doing that, I encourage you to try to self-diagnose. Which leader type are you? And then also, if you're not a leader or if you don't want to self-diagnose, think of the female leaders that you interact with in your workplace and try to place them. And I think it will help you sort of, apply some of these concepts that we've been talking about today. So leader number 1, this leader is in the quadrant where she denies her feminine communication style, and she's also low power. This leader struggles with interpersonal communication, which is that number 1 function of leadership language, cultivating relationships. This is statistically not a very common type of female leader. So her linguistic traits are that she's very polite, correct, respectful, indirect, and under-emphatic. And a non-linguistic example of this leader is that she's a senior woman who advises others to play down their femininity or doughtify themselves to gain respect. Okay, again, not a super common type. Leader number 2 is a common leader type. She's in the quadrant where she accepts her feminine communication style, but she's also low power. And she struggles with authoritative communication. So that's that number 2 function of leadership language, making decisions. Her linguistic traits are that she's likely to use double voicing, right? So preempting a criticism by criticizing herself first. She's cooperative, supportive, caring, and involved, positive, and indirect. And a non-linguistic example of this type of leader is a senior woman who's the confidant of all the male leaders and might be subjected to frequent low-level flirtation, right? So I actually, in my life, can think of a lot of female leaders that I know fit this bill. Sort of in my mind, this type of leader might be, quote unquote, like the token woman in the leadership circle at an organization, right? Where she's valued because she's a woman, but not because of her contributions. And we obviously want both, right? Okay, so on to leader number 3. This is actually the most common type of female leader. So this type of female leader denies their feminine communication style, and she's high power. Her linguistic traits are that she's a classic example of the double bind, where she adopts a masculine conversational style to try to fit into the leader box. And a non-linguistic example of this type of leader is a senior woman who advocates for a gender-neutral approach to everything and encourages women to play down their femaleness and play up their hard work and achievements in the company. So I have personally interacted with many, many leaders of this type where they're like, just to use sort of a term of the moment, right? They're sort of gender blind, right? Or they say that they want to be. Like, it doesn't matter if you're a woman. We're just going to focus on, you know, your hard work and your achievements. But for the same reasons that being colorblind does a disservice to people of color, being gender blind also does a disservice to women in the workplace, because what it does is that it says, I want to be able to see your work, but I don't want to acknowledge that becoming a leader is for you than for anybody else, right? And so this type of female leader is actually doing a disservice to like female leaders of the future in that way, right? And so the struggle here is, again, the interaction between interpersonal and authoritative communication. Now, leader number 4, this type of leader accepts feminine communication style, and she's high power. So her linguistic traits are that she uses a feminine conversational style to do leadership within the company while modifying conversational style based on the discursive context, right? So discursively constructing her identity as a leader. She cultivates relationships, makes decisions, and achieves outcomes, and is sort of integrating those pieces of leadership language and the functions that they serve. Okay. So that's sort of a summary of the 4 types based on Sinclair's framework. And also what's nice about these 4 types is that they really integrate the examples of double voicing and double bind that we just covered. Okay, we've made it, everybody. So this is the final takeaway slide. We're going to take our last break. And I know we are much over time because of our sort of slow start and the little technical glitch in the middle. But after we come back, after this 1-minute break, we're just going to go over a review and conclusions, and we'll be ready to rock and roll. So thank you so much for sticking with me, and I'll be back here in just a minute. All right, everybody, that was about a minute. We just covered language, and I gave some examples of how it functions as the actual thing, the tool that we use to do leadership, or, you know, the technology, right? We went over some examples of specifically linguistic barriers to female leadership, and now we're going to move into the so what, right? There was a lot of learning in this session today. I'd like to think, though, that this specific audience is excited and ready for all that new information. But new information is not enough, right? We want to have a plan to move forward. And so what I really want to leave you with in this session is that the language lens gives us the most hope for understanding, supporting, and training female leaders. And the reason I'm taking the linguistic approach gives us the most hope is because, 1, language has technical properties. It can be heard, seen, counted, measured, practiced, learned, and optimized. That means, you know, that that big word communication that was so confusing before, or that's causing that 96% of executive statistic, that can be broken down and understood, right? We can count it, we can see it, we can track it over time, right? The second reason that language gives us the most hope for solving female barriers to female leadership is that language use actualizes our identity, right? So not only do we reveal who we are by how much or by how we use our language tech, we also create the leader that we are through language use. And so by understanding the linguistic functions of leadership, and by understanding, you know, types of leaders and how they use language, we can better, you know, leverage language to become the leader that we want to be. And then finally, language as a system and understanding it as a technology really takes us out of the nebulous and puts us into the concrete. So, you know, big concept words like leadership, communication, confidence, which is the thing that they use with women all the time, and I'm so over it, those things can just go from concepts and turn into outcomes that we can achieve through language. I can achieve leadership through language. I can achieve communication through language, and I can achieve confidence through language. Right? And so now what we want to know is like, okay, I want to bring this back to my company, and how can I achieve those concepts, or right, those outcomes through language? And this is how. Okay, I'm going to give you a little bit of a roadmap in the next slide that'll walk you through the steps to really applying this kind of information. And before I do that, I just want to say that all gendered issues in the workplace sort of are dichotomous in that they either are intensely personal, like there's explicit linguistic discrimination, or they're alternatively deeply structural, so ingrained in the organizational culture. But either way, it's the responsibility of the organization, especially now in today's day and age, to tackle both of these dichotomous traits, right? To both help the individual in their gender, acceptance journey, right? And also to, examine the organization to solve gender issues there. And so as we move into a strategic roadmap for how we can actually solve this problem, we want to address both the intensely personal and the deeply structural. And so this is a 5-point flow. You want to start at the top and move down to the bottom. So awareness, of course, with any like sociological issue, you have to start with awareness. That's an example of that is something like what we did here. So many of you maybe didn't even know what linguistics was exactly when we started, and now you have this intense awareness about linguistic leadership, and specifically the gender nature of leadership. And then, the next thing we have to do, though, is come up with a way to identify the deeply structural. What is the problem from an organizational perspective? And what that really requires is collecting data. And not data like numbers about business performance, right? But collecting language data. We want to record our meetings. We're going to analyze our meetings for linguistic features. We're going to analyze how our leaders lead their teams, right? In, a anonymous and respectful way so that we can better help the organization tackle the deeply structured parts of gender bias. And then after you have a data picture, both maybe for individual leaders or across the organization as a whole to have some metadata on that, you want to combine the intensely personal and the deeply structural into training so that you're saying, we're going to help you understand what's going on both in our organization and then also what might be happening with you personally. And we're going to unpack what that data means. And then finally, after you have the data, you've explained the data, so you're being transparent, you want to set up a practice regimen, okay, making goals, both individual goals and organizational goals. And a lot of times what these goals will include are setting up and following some linguistic rules in your organization. There are tons of ways to do this, and sometimes this maybe even goes back to rewriting an employee handbook or something. But one example that I like to share is, in a specific meeting with a certain subset of employees, you might want to say, have like a banned phrases list that's funny, and everybody in the room has to follow the rule. Nobody can say those phrases, and if you do, you maybe have to put in a quarter or something into the swear jar or whatever. And then what it does is it requires everybody in the meeting to be super aware of their language use, which is good in general, but also it might prevent some of those sexist environments, like the silencing, right? So that it allows female leaders in the group to actually practice, maybe not trapping themselves in a double bind or not doing double voicing, right? So you can sort of stir the meetings in such a way that you're practicing these skills, ways to be a leader by using your feminine communication style successfully, right? And then after you practice, of course, you have to track to make sure that your practice is paying off. And this really requires regular data checks to show how the intensely personal and the deeply structural are changing over time. And this is the final slide, everybody. Here's the thing. Language is a living technology, and it's constantly changing. But the changes are good because they reflect the values and beliefs of the next generation, and those people are the clients, customers, and coworkers that you care about. And so it is worth learning this language, this technology, right? And it's also worth keeping up. And with that, I thank you so much for joining me in this presentation. I'll happily answer any questions that you have. And you'll notice here that I do have some works cited here. So if anybody has any questions or wants access to that later, please just let me know. And feel free to reach out. Thank you so much.